In this tutorial we're going to just give you a basic introduction to unwrapping. So why do we need to unwrap? And what are the kind of basic tools we can use? Okay, so the main reason for unwrapping is to flatten every part of our 3D model down onto a 2D space. Now the reason we do that is so that we can paint 2D textures for it. Okay, so if we just select this model here and apply an unwrap, and then click on the Open UV editor, this is the kind of unwrap for this model. So we can see every element of the model has actually been flattened out and just laid out on this 2D space. If we then apply our texture into the Unwrapped window, you can see how this can work in Photoshop. So I've taken this template into Photoshop and then painted over each section. Now the reason why the majority of models use an unwrap like this is because you can get the most out of your 2D texture space. You can use basic techniques like UVW map, but the problem with those is it's very hard to be precise, especially when you've got a kind of complex model like this with all kind of manner of different shapes on it. It's also kind of a common technique used in industry is to have a model with one texture applied, so you've got one texture set per model. And again, that's why you have to use unwrap, so that you can take every component of your model and flatten it onto this 2D space. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this kind of unwrap window then. So we've applied an unwrap modifier, and we've gone to Open UV editor, and this is the window you're presented with. I'm just going to turn off that preview a sec. So you can see it can be a little bit kind of confusing at first, but you can see you've got these kind of grey, dark grey borders around this square here. Now this square represents the 2D texture that you're going to be painting into. So although I can pull elements out of this, that means they're not within this texture plate anymore. So the reason you've got all this surrounding space is just for kind of editing. So I can unwrap this section out here just away from all of these bits, and it can makes it kind of a lot easier. It's really hard to kind of do everything just within this one square. There are other reasons for this external area for when you're using tiling textures, but that's something we'll cover at a later date. For now, you can just kind of use it knowing that you have to fit everything within these grey borders, and you can use the outside space for editing pieces before you fit them into this space. Now obviously the difference between a good unwrap and a bad unwrap. A good unwrap is where you use all of your texture space. So if we look here, you can actually see there's areas of this texture that aren't being used. All these black areas here, anywhere where there's no model overlaying. So just to give you a better example of that, if I come to Tools, Render UVW Template, and just set this to solid, there is my actual unwrap. So all this black space here is actually wasted texture space. So although this unwrap is reasonable, could definitely be improvements. Like I could scale these elements up to kind of fit here. Using this Render UV template, I can actually take this image into Photoshop and just start painting over the top of this. Just to give you a demo of that. call this unwrap example. And then open Photoshop. Then if I go to File, Open, I now have this image in Photoshop, and I can use this template to start painting my texture on. So I could just kind of paint over with whatever kind of colours I need and build up layers for each section. Okay, so that's the kind of basic reason why we unwrap. We unwrap a model, lay it all out in the texture window, and then export it into Photoshop so you can paint your texture. The reason we do it is for kind of preciseness, and so you can lay out each element properly rather than just using unwrap. Just using UVW mapping, and so we can make the best kind of use of our texture space. Obviously, the better you unwrap, the easier it is to paint your texture. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is you're going to actually have a go at using the tools. So what I want you to do is just build a basic cylinder and a basic box model and a plane. So let's unwrap this box first. So if you just come over to the Modifier tab and apply an Unwrap UVW modifier to this box, and then go to Open UV Editor. So this is the kind of default window you're presented with. I always turn that off. That's your kind of texture display, but for now we have no reason for that because we haven't got an actual texture. So just like in Edit Poly, you've got vertices, edge and polygon mode. So if I just try selecting polygon mode, I can select individual polygons in the viewport. If I go to vertex mode, I can select individual vertices as well. If I go to edge mode, I can select individual edges. Okay, so you can manipulate each of these items. So if I select that edge, I can actually kind of move that around in this window. Okay, so you are initially kind of pretty much always presented with this kind of confusing original layout. So there's a couple of kind of basic tools just to get you started. What you have, if you go over to the Mapping tab, you see you have Flatten Mapping, Normal Mapping and Unfold. And then on the right over here in your toolbar you have your standard UVW tools, Planar Map, Cylindrical Map, Sphere and Box. So let's just try selecting each face of our model. So we can select them all like that, or you can select them all in your view. You can see it actually has ignore back facing on by default, so you can just turn that off, and then in the view you can select everything. So let's try some of these tools out. If we come to Mapping and go to Unfold, you'll see it will just unfold your box for you. and also fit it within the texture window, so everything within these kind of dark grey borders. Okay, let's try some other techniques out. We've also got flatten mapping, which will lay each side out independently. And you've got normal mapping as well, which has something like box mapping. And you've got kind of back front mapping as well. Now pretty much the way you unwrap is by using a kind of mix of these different techniques, using these projection tools, and if they don't work you can then use your kind of basic editing tools as well. So like your kind of vertex. You do find that when you get more complex models there are bits that you need to tweak by hand, and that's when these tools kind of come in really handy. Just kind of normal edit poly modes, but within this kind of 2D space. So what you're aiming for when you unwrap is two things. The first one is for ease of texture painting, and the second one is to avoid seams as much as possible. So if I just select all the polygons in this model and then go to flatten mapping, you'll see it's separated each polygon out into kind of an individual piece. Now this is kind of making pretty good use of the texture space, because there's only a bit of wasted area here and in these gaps. But the problem is that this unwrap will be hard to paint, because if this side matches this side, so you see on the model there, if I had, say, wood that flowed around here, then it'd be difficult to paint this in Photoshop to get it to match. If I then tried unfold mapping instead, you'll see that all the pieces are now joined together. So this would be much easier to paint in that I can just paint straight across these in Photoshop, and there's no gaps, so there'll be no issue with seams. But the difference with this version is that I'm using much less of my texture space. So let's just try both of these out. So to actually get these into Photoshop, if you come to Tools, Render UVW Template, and just make sure Mode is set to Solid, and hit Render UV Template. So there's our template. So we'll save this out as Unwrap Example 2, and we'll use JPEG format. And then we'll select all of them again, and this time do flatten mapping. And again go to Tools, Render UV Template, and render this one. Call this Unwrap Example 3 and save that. Okay, so if we go back into Photoshop, and I want you to open the two examples we've just created. So in our first example here, I want you to click the Add New Layer button, and then we'll just add something like a disgusting kind of yellowy colour. We then add a new layer on top of that and turn off this layer. Then I want you to select black from your colours here, and by clicking just outside the image and holding shift and then clicking again, you can create a line, or you can hold shift and just drag. Make sure you left click first and hold shift and drag to create another line. I then want you to do the same from the top here and down on here. Then just select the text tool and we'll just call this test crate. I'm going to select all the text, change it to black up here, and change the size of the font. Turn that layer back on, and in fact, just to show you the rest of this, if we turn that layer back off, select the background layer and come over to the Magic Wand tool and just click in one of the black areas and then hold shift and click in the other two black areas as well. And then come back to layer 1 and just hit delete. Okay, so there's our first texture plane. We'll then just save this out as texture test. So this is just a JPEG. And if we come back into 3DSMax and make sure you undo your unwrap so it goes back to that one, just Control Z. Close down your Unwrapped window, open your material editor, and in a new slot here, just assign that bitmap as a texture. If we then apply that to the model and hit preview, you can see we've got our test crate on the side and those lines go all the way around. They don't connect here and here. If you open your Unwrap window and go to polygon mode, say select that side and that side, you can see it's the 2 points where it doesn't meet. You can go to checker pattern here, pick texture, bitmap, and assign that in the window just to see what's going on. So this is when seams occur. You can see here all of these are attached, so there's no seam between them, but where you get this edge where it's an open edge and nothing connects, and this edge where it's an open edge and nothing connects, that's where you create a seam. So on the model they join together, but in the Unwrap window they don't. So let's go back into Photoshop and then try painting the same texture onto this. You can see it would actually be pretty much impossible. If you go to brush mode, hold Alt and click on this colour, you will colour pick it. So in this one we'll add a new layer and fill that. Then add another new layer, and then somehow we've got to get those black lines to line up. So I could try a similar technique to before by left clicking somewhere and then holding shift and dragging, then doing the same up to here, but really I've got no idea what I'm doing from this window. You can see how much harder it would be to actually texture paint using this window. If I right click on my text layer, I can go to duplicate layer and actually put that into Unwrap example 3. And I'll just try dragging that to there. Then I want you to do the same again, select the background, magic wand, and click on the black area, turn on that layer and just hit delete. So we'll save this out as texture test 2, and then in Max, in your Unwrapped window, select all the polygons and hit flatten mapping. Then in your material editor, assign our other texture. So you can see nothing lines up at all now. We've got loads more seams, and it's much harder to paint the texture to actually get it to line up. So this is why this is a bad unwrap and this is a good unwrap. Okay, so when you're unwrapping a box type model, it's good to aim for an unwrap that looks like that. The classic way to kind of unwrap models is to look at each component of the model and break it down into individual shapes, whether that's a box, a cylinder, a plane, or a sphere. Just like you would with drawing, where you break down your initial sketch into basic shapes, that's the kind of way you think about unwrapping. So if it's a box type shape, this is the general kind of unwrap you want to aim for. So let's have a look at how we would unwrap a cylinder. So if we select this cylinder model and again apply an unwrap, again hit the Open UV Editor tab, turn off this preview, you can see what you're presented with by default. Now the problem with this, the default one in 3DSMax, is the bottom and the top don't have any texture space. There's no way you could paint a texture on the top or the bottom. So to unwrap a cylinder, again we select the entire model, turn off ignore back facing if you want to do it in the viewport, and we go to mapping, unfold mapping, and hit OK. So now we've got each area of the cylinder actually assigned its own place in the texture window. Now the problem with this unwrap, if we look at this, is this is on a diagonal. So to paint this in Photoshop is going to cause us a few problems. So what we can do is just select it all and using rotate, just rotate that round. And try and get it as straight as possible. You can actually use angle snap as well, so that it will snap to a precise angle. Okay, but so this is the classic kind of shape you want to look for when you're unwrapping a cylinder. So you want the top, the bottom, and all the sides laid out like so. Top, bottom, and all the side area too. Now again you can see we've got a seam from this area here to this line here. There is a seam down here. Now seams are always going to exist, you're always going to have some seams, but really you want to aim for kind of as few as possible while still using as much texture space as possible. If you just select, so looking at this, we could probably use the texture space a bit better. If we select the top and the bottom by using Control to add to the selection, if you go to Tools, well, first of all just select them and try moving them, and you'll see they're actually stuck to this model. If you go to Tools, Break, you can actually move those off. So let's try just moving those to the side there. Then selecting this whole piece and actually scaling that up. So we've just scaled everything up, and we're actually making a better use of the texture space in that way. Now obviously the seams that are difficult on a cylinder are matching this to this. You might need to do that, and that can be a tricky thing to get right sometimes, but there's no kind of real way to avoid it. So a cylinder unwrap should really either look like this, or if you want your top and your bottom to be on the side, it should look like that. Okay, so now select the basic plain model and go again, apply an unwrap and go to Open UV Editor. So by default a plane is actually kind of unwrapped for you, but if you did have an area like this, to unwrap it you can try flatten mapping, or you can try normal mapping, either back front, left right, or top bottom. Obviously this will be top bottom because this is facing top and bottom. If this was on its side, you would try left right or front back. Okay, so let's just quickly make a kind of basic model for unwrapping. So we'll have, what I want you to do is make a small box here. You don't have to be too precise about this. In fact, I'll just clone that one to there. Select this one here and convert that to an editable poly. And then we'll use the inset tool just to pull this in, extrude to extrude out. We'll quickly just remove all these segments from this. And then we'll go to, well, first of all we'll stick this cylinder up here and use scale. Shortcut to scale, move, rotate and scale. R, W, E and R. So you've got R for scale, E for rotate and W for move. I tend to use the right click menu to select them though. Okay, so we'll just plonk this on top of here and just leave it like that. So select this model here, go to attach and just attach each of these. Okay, so here's our basic model we're going to unwrap. So if we apply an unwrap modifier, open our UV editor and turn off the texture preview, you'll see that by default everything is kind of overlaid on each other, so you're often kind of presented with this confusing window that can really kind of throw people off. And this is when it's best to kind of use your viewport rather than your window to start with. So if we go to polygon mode and select by element, and then we'll just select each component in our scene and just drag them out. Okay. So the first thing we'll do are just the basic cylinders. So with select element still turned on, we'll select the cylinder in this view and go to mapping, unfold. And there's our first cylinder model. You can see we're selecting polygons individually here, but if you turn on select by element, you can just click to select. So we'll do the same on each of these cylinders. Okay, so that's our 3 cylinders done. So next we'll have a look at this model here. Now we can try unfold on this, and you can see it's kind of messed it up a little bit. So this is when you look at a model and you actually break it down into smaller components. So we can see the actual, this top area is a box and this bottom area is a box. So turn off select by element and just select each individual piece of that box, and then do mapping, unfold mapping. And we can see that that actually hasn't done a great job either. And this is what happens basically. Sometimes unfold doesn't do the job you want. See, because now we've got, if we look at this, we've got the top there and each side like so. But really, when we come to paint this, this side should connect to this side. So it's not an ideal unwrap. It's going to be hard to texture paint. So if we select all 4 sides and break it down even further, we can try mapping, unfold, and that's better. Now we've got each side lined up. And it actually hasn't done that quite correctly either. So if it still hasn't done it correctly, we can try flatten mapping. We can see that's laid each piece out, but they're not connected. So let's connect these together. So to do that, if you come into vertex mode, make sure select by element is turned on, and then turn on snap. Then just select each piece and connect them together. Now what you can do here is you can actually use the blue edges, and that tells you where they're connected. So I can see that this piece sits in between these two, and that this piece either sits on there like so. So that's all 4 pieces connected together. If I select this top piece, and again using the blue edges, so if I select this end vert, I can see that that's connected to this edge, so I can just pull that in like so. If the size isn't right, turn off select by element, select these 2 verts and just pull them to there. Okay, so that's much better. We haven't got any seams between these other than this top and this bottom, and you're always going to have a couple, and we've got the seams from the top there, but again you're never going to be able to avoid all of those. Okay, so if we just come to this other box here, there's our top section, there are our 4 sides, and there's the bottom. So that's actually not a bad job. You might want to have each of these sides connected to that rather than the bottom. So we can try that. Let's select the top and select each side other than the bottom like that, and try unfolding that. And it's given us that, which isn't quite right. We need to select these 2 sides and attach them to the here. So to do that, if you see you pull them, they're actually still attached. So go to Tools, Break, and you can take them off. Go to Vertex mode and turn on Select by Element. and select this, we can see this is attached to this, and it's this side that should go. Then you can then use these rotate tools to rotate 90 degrees and then snap them into place. And the same for this piece here. So again, we can see that yes, this is attached to this side. If I select this vert, I can see it's this long edge here. So rotate that way and snap that into place. Okay, so this can then attach to these. So I can see that if I select these edges, that's these two, so I need to flip this before I attach it. So just select them all and go to Tools, Flip Horizontal. I can then drag that into place. You can see it's not quite fitting, so if you turn off Select by Element, you can select these verts and just snap them to there. Okay, so that's all of our pieces unwrapped, but we can see that they're not actually in this window, and also they're at different scales. So another important thing about texture painting is making sure that, and unwrapping, is making sure that each area has the same amount of texture space, so that this wouldn't look really high detail in game and this look really low detail in game. You want to make sure they both look the same level of detail. So to do that, we use a checker map. So if I just open the material editor, come over to a new slot, and in my diffuse apply a checker. I can then set my tiling to say 15, apply that to the model and make it visible. And to match the scale, you just look at each component of the model and you can see these squares, and what you want to do is make sure that the squares are the same size on every part of the model, and then you know that they will have the same amount of texture space. So if I go to Select by Element and select this and then go to Scale, I can use Scale, and I'm going to match them to these squares. I can use Scale to match them up. Okay, so I'm happy with that now. Everything's just about matched up. You're never going to get it precise, like you'll always be a little bit out. So don't worry, don't spend a massive amount of time on this stage. Now I need to fit all these into this window, and I can already see that I'm never going to be able to fit all of these in, so I need to scale them down a bit. So I'm just going to select everything and just scale it down, and then you can try fitting this into the texture space. Remember, you can use tools like rotate up here if you think, I can fit this in. And also you can make minor tweaks. Really you want, so I'm just going to turn off element mode so I can just select these two vertices. I'm just going to pull those in a little bit. I'm going to turn off snap as well so that I can actually move it without it snapping. Turn on element mode and polygon mode again. Fit these into the space. Make sure that everything's within the grey border, and that's your unwrap. You're now ready to take that into Photoshop and texture paint it. So that's the kind of basic tools of unwrapping. You've got move, rotate and scale, vertex, edge and polygon mode, select by element is very useful. You've got rotate 90 degrees for each element, flip horizontal and vertical, and you've got unfold mapping, flatten mapping and normal mapping here. A couple of tools we didn't look at but which we will be looking at in later tutorials. Your projection tools up here, peel mode, and kind of grouping elements together. So there's a lot we haven't covered yet, but they're the kind of basic tools for now.